When a narcissist suddenly disappears, no calls, no texts, no explanation, it triggers a uniquely disorienting psychological response. The silence feels loud, loaded with meaning, and often interpreted as a deliberate tactic designed to manipulate, punish, or regain control. But the reality, while less dramatic in intent, is often far more unsettling in implication. The absence of communication from a narcissist is rarely about you in the way you think it is. It is not necessarily a calculated move designed to make you chase them. Nor is it a sign that they are sitting somewhere, overwhelmed by thoughts of you. More often, it reflects a shift in where they are sourcing emotional validation, attention, and psychological fuel, commonly referred to as supply. Understanding this dynamic requires abandoning the comforting illusion that their behavior revolves around your value as a person, and instead recognizing that it revolves around their needs as a system. At the core of narcissistic behavior is a dependency on external input to regulate internal instability. Narcissists do not generate a stable sense of self internally. Instead, they extract it from interactions, attention, admiration, emotional reactions, conflict, validation. These are not just pleasant experiences for them. They are functional requirements. Without supply, they experience psychological depletion. Because of this, their behavior is not anchored to loyalty, consistency, or emotional attachment in the conventional sense. It is anchored to efficiency. Where can they get the most reliable, least resistant form of supply at any given moment? This is where the silence begins to make sense. If a narcissist stops contacting you for an extended period, the most probable explanation is not that they are attempting to control you from a distance. Control, by definition, requires interaction. Without access to your reactions, your emotions, your attention, they cannot exert influence. Silence removes their ability to monitor and manipulate your state. So, if they are not engaging, it is not because they have found a more advanced strategy of control. It is because they are engaged elsewhere. In practical terms, this means they have redirected their focus to another source of supply. This could be a new romantic partner, a former partner re-engaged, a social circle, or even a professional environment that is currently providing sufficient validation. The key point is that their needs are being met without requiring input from you. And when a narcissist's needs are being met efficiently, they deprioritize alternative sources, not necessarily eliminating them, but placing them on standby. This standby dynamic is critical to understand. Narcissists rarely operate with clean closures. They do not tend to end relationships definitively unless forced to do so or unless maintaining the connection becomes more costly than beneficial. Instead, they leave relational doors partially open. This allows them to cycle back if their current source of supply becomes unstable, insufficient, or collapses entirely. In this framework, your silence from them is not necessarily a permanent exit. It is a temporary deactivation. From your perspective, this creates a psychological trap. You interpret the silence as meaningful, perhaps as a test, a punishment, or even a reflection of hidden emotional struggle on their part. You may wonder if they miss you, if they are thinking about reaching out, if they are trying to provoke a reaction. But these interpretations are projections based on how a non-narcissistic individual might behave. A person with a stable attachment system might withdraw due to emotional overwhelm, fear, or a need for space, while still maintaining an internal connection to you. A narcissist's withdrawal, however, is typically transactional. It reflects a shift in resource allocation, not a deepening of emotional processing. There is another layer to this dynamic that complicates things further: perceived resistance. If a narcissist detects that you are becoming more aware of their behavior, more likely to challenge them, or more inclined to set boundaries, your value, as a source of supply decreases, not because you are less worthy, but because you are less efficient. Supply that requires effort, accountability, or negotiation is less attractive than supply that is readily available and compliant. In this context, silence can also indicate avoidance. They may disengage not because they no longer want supply from you at all, but because the cost of extracting it has increased. This is often misinterpreted as growth or realization on their part. You might think, they're staying away because they know I see through them, or they're respecting my boundaries. While this interpretation feels empowering, it is usually inaccurate. They are not respecting boundaries in the way a healthy individual would. They are bypassing obstacles. If engaging with you requires navigating resistance, they will redirect their efforts elsewhere until circumstances change. An important misconception to dismantle is the idea that narcissists inherently need specific individuals. They do not need you as a unique person in the way you may need them. They need supply. If you provide a type of supply that is rare or particularly potent, such as intense admiration, emotional depth, or consistent availability, you may be categorized as high-value supply. In such cases, they are more likely to maintain intermittent contact to keep access open. But if your supply is perceived as replaceable or secondary, they may feel no urgency to maintain the connection. This leads to a difficult but necessary conclusion. Prolonged silence is often an indicator of low prioritization. It suggests that within their current hierarchy of supply sources, you are not at the top. This is not a reflection of your intrinsic worth, but it is a reflection of how they are valuing your utility. And within a narcissistic framework, utility is what determines behavior. However, the story does not end with silence. One of the most predictable patterns in narcissistic dynamics is cyclical re-engagement. When their current source of supply becomes unstable due to conflict, exposure, boredom, or collapse, they will often return to previous sources. This is sometimes referred to as hoovering, a term used to describe attempts to draw former partners back into the dynamic. The timing of this return is not random. It is driven by need. When their current system fails to provide sufficient input, they reactivate dormant connections. This is why someone who has not contacted you for months may suddenly reappear with a casual message, as if no time has passed. The re-entry is often low effort and non-specific. "Hey, how have you been?" Or, "I was just thinking about you." The goal is not to acknowledge the absence or repair the rupture. It is to test accessibility. If you respond, they assess whether you are still a viable source of supply. If you do not, they may escalate slightly or move on to another option. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, this pattern is highly consistent. It is not driven by deep emotional reconsideration or a newfound appreciation for you. It is driven by resource management. Understanding this removes much of the confusion surrounding their silence and return. It reframes the dynamic from something personal and mysterious to something systematic and predictable. Another factor worth examining is the role of ambiguity. Narcissists often avoid providing clear explanations for their behavior. They do not typically say, "I'm focusing on someone else right now," or "I'm not interested in maintaining contact." Instead, they disappear. This lack of transparency serves multiple functions. It prevents accountability, maintains flexibility, and preserves plausible deniability. If they return later, they can act as though nothing significant happened, minimizing the disruption and avoiding confrontation. For the person on the receiving end, this ambiguity is destabilizing. Humans are wired to seek closure and coherence. When someone disappears without explanation, the mind attempts to fill in the gaps. This often leads to overanalysis, self-blame, and rumination. You may replay interactions, looking for signs of what went wrong, or construct narratives that position their silence as a reflection of your shortcomings. This cognitive loop reinforces emotional attachment, even in the absence of actual interaction. Breaking out of this loop requires a shift in interpretation. Instead of asking, "What does their silence mean about me?" the more accurate question is, "What does their silence reveal about their operating system?" When viewed through this lens, the behavior becomes less about your value and more about their patterns. It becomes data rather than judgment. There is also a strategic component to how silence is perceived. Many people believe that not reaching out gives the narcissist power, or conversely, that reaching out reclaims control. In reality, both interpretations can be misleading. Power in this dynamic is not determined by who initiates contact. It is determined by who is less dependent on the interaction. If your emotional state is contingent on whether they respond, they hold leverage. If their behavior does not significantly impact your state, the leverage diminishes. This is why no-contact strategies are often recommended in recovery from narcissistic relationships. The goal is not to punish the narcissist or provoke a reaction. It is to remove yourself from the supply system entirely. By doing so, you reduce their ability to influence your emotional state and create space to rebuild internal stability. However, it is important to approach this with realistic expectations. No contact is not a tactic to make them miss you or come back. It is a boundary to protect your own psychological integrity. One of the more uncomfortable truths in this context is that narcissists can go extended periods without thinking about you at all. This contradicts the common belief that they are constantly preoccupied with past partners. While they may revisit connections when it is convenient or necessary, they are not typically engaging in sustained reflection or longing. Their attention is directed toward whatever is currently providing the most immediate return. This does not mean they are incapable of remembering you or recognizing your value. It means that memory and value do not drive behavior in the same way they do for non-narcissistic individuals. Behavior is driven by current utility. If you are not currently serving a function, you are not in focus. At the same time, it is important not to oversimplify narcissists as entirely devoid of emotional experience. They can experience attachment, but it is often conditional and unstable. They can experience loss, but it is frequently tied to the loss of supply rather than the loss of the person as a whole. They can experience distress, but it is usually triggered by threats to their self-image rather than relational disconnection. Recognizing these nuances helps avoid both demonization and idealization. Returning to the central question, what it means when a narcissist does not call or text you for a long time, the answer is multifaceted but coherent. It most commonly indicates that they are engaged with another source of supply that is currently meeting their needs more effectively. It may also indicate that engaging with you has become less efficient due to increased resistance or awareness on your part. It reflects a deprioritization within their internal hierarchy, not necessarily a permanent decision, but a current allocation of attention. Crucially, it does not indicate that they are sitting in silence, overwhelmed by thoughts of you, nor does it reliably indicate a strategic attempt to control you through absence. While silence can be used as a tactic in some contexts, prolonged disengagement is more often a byproduct of engagement elsewhere. Understanding this shifts the focus from decoding their behavior to evaluating your own position within the dynamic. Instead of asking what their silence means, the more productive question becomes, what does my reaction to their silence reveal about my own attachment patterns, expectations, and boundaries? This is where meaningful change occurs, not in predicting or influencing their behavior, but in recalibrating your own responses. Ultimately, the absence of communication is information. It tells you where you stand in their current structure. It reveals how they allocate attention and assign value. More importantly, it gives you a decision point, whether you remain available within that structure or step outside of it entirely.